listener production.
Hello, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. It's hard to believe we are approaching the third anniversary of the war in Ukraine. One of the biggest challenges for both sides has been getting enough troops who can fight on the ground. And in a recent turn of events, North Korea has offered up its own troops to Russia. It adds a new level of complexity to the war.
The thing to note about North Korea is that they are now a nuclear power and therefore untouchable. So if the Americans were going to stop the North Korean regime, it should have been done years ago. It's now too late.
In the second half of this episode, we break down what this means for not only the war, but also international relations the world over. First, though, it's time for the headlines with Chris Spiru on Thursday, October 24.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Coalition politicians are pushing for new penalties for parliamentarians in the wake of Lidia Thorpe's protest against King Charles. Simon Birmingham, who's the head of the opposition in the Senate, says disorderly conduct punishments should be brought in for senators who engage in the behaviour outside the chamber. On Monday afternoon, Thorpe stormed a speech by Charles, shouting that he was not her king and called him a genocidalist. It's understood the government is weighing up whether to take action, if any, against the senator.
Meantime, Thorpe has defended herself from questions about why she broke her parliamentary oath with the protest, saying she never swore allegiance to the king when she was sworn in.
I swore allegiance to the Queen's hairs. If you listen close enough, it wasn't her heirs, it was her hairs that I was giving my allegiance to. And now that, they're no longer here, I don't know where that stands.
Yeah, that's Thorpe speaking on the ABC. Sure enough, when you listen back to the moment, she does say hairs. It's worth noting, though, in the Hansard transcript, it actually is written as heirs. And at the end of the day, she did also sign the oath, which had heirs spelled correctly. So there have been questions now, Chris, as to whether her oath is void because she mispronounced it apparently on purpose, according to Thorpe herself. And there is no precedent for whether her mispronunciation makes her oath void. A constitutional law expert did tell the ABC it'd be a matter for the presiding officer in the Senate to make this assessment as to whether or not she validly bound herself. And Thorpe has said, she will not be resigning over this. So she's really doubling down.
And sticking with the issue, Charles has arrived in Samoa for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. So political leaders at the event are planning to push the UK for an apology and reparations over slavery carried out by the British Empire. All three candidates to become the next Commonwealth Secretary-General have declared their support for reparations for slavery and colonisation. But British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has ruled out wanting to do that.
Yeah, and it's worth noting as well, the Pacific leaders at CHOGM, as it's referred to, they're not really engaging on this issue either, and climate change is expected to dominate the talks, and that's what they want the focus to be on.
Over to Russia now, where Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has confirmed at least 4 people have been killed and 14 others wounded in an attack near Turkey's capital. This story is developing, with no individual or group yet to claim responsibility, but so far we do know that at least 2 armed assailants opened fire on a state-owned aerospace and defence company some 40 kilometres north of Ankara. Speaking alongside Russia's President Vladimir Putin, Erdogan referred to the victims as martyrs and condemned it as a heinous terrorist attack. According to Turkish officials, 2 suspects have been, quote, neutralised, with witnesses saying they heard gunfire and an explosion at the site.
So this official confirmation from Erdogan came on the sidelines of the BRICS summit, where Putin had earlier scored a pretty big win in facilitating formal talks between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The pair haven't formally met in 5 years, and this marked a key moment at the summit where the Kremlin is trying to show that the West have failed to isolate Russia over the Ukraine war. And this meeting comes just 2 days after New Delhi announced it had reached an agreement with Beijing to resolve a 4-year military standoff along their disputed Himalayan border. So lots of interesting things happening in international politics at the moment. We are deep diving that as well later on in this episode.
Back home now, Coles and Woolworths have denied tricking customers with dodgy discounts. You might remember last month the ACCC launched legal action against the 2 big supermarkets, alleging they had violated consumer law by using promotions to mislead shoppers. They allegedly did this by increasing prices of hundreds of products before dropping them. to make it seem like they were cheaper. Well, the federal court heard from the supermarket's lawyers yesterday in the case, with both denying the allegations and saying the issue has been misconceived.
Yeah, so I guess the question is what happens next? Well, this is just the first kind of step in this long drawn-out process. Both supermarkets now have to file a written response to the ACCC's legal allegations, and they have to do that by November 29. They'll then return to the federal court in December for another case management hearing. So, like I said, first step in a long legal battle, and now that we know that Coles and Woolies are defending themselves, it's only going to take longer, although we didn't really expect anything different. Look, just some little tidbits, we know how much scrutiny the two major supermarkets are under at the moment. It's worth noting this is just one thing that they are facing at the moment. There's a bunch of inquiries. There's Senate committee hearings going on. There's more reports coming from the ACCC that are separate to this legal case. So they are under intense pressure, but they're really doubling down on most things. They just keep saying, customers are first and we're doing the right thing. Coles and Woolworths do make up 67% of the supermarket sector, and it took 20 years for the next largest chain, Aldi, to get to 9% of the market share. And that's one of the big things is that Coles and Woolies are dominating. It's essentially a duopoly, and it's shoppers who are losing as a result. And we are being told to brace for more solar storms and possible technology failure as the sun hits its peak energy output. NASA has announced we are now in what's called solar maximum phase. So this is part of an 11-year cycle and is set to last for the next 2 years, Chris.
And one symptom of peak solar output is geomagnetic storms. They trigger auroras, and we've been treated to a few of those in Australia this year already, Sash. The other risk is to our technology. So a solar storm in 1859, dubbed the Carrington event, saw auroras light up the tropics and cause telegraph machines, basically those things that transmit Morse code, beep, boop, beep, boop, beep, to catch fire. Experts say a storm of that magnitude right now would inflict devastating blackouts and up to $2.6 trillion in economic costs in America alone. So that's 3.9 trillion Australian dollars, Sash.
Yeah, when I first saw this headline, I was like, here we go, another space story. But when you actually read into what happens, it's really, really interesting. And experts say that we are more vulnerable to Carrington-level storms, quote unquote, in 2024 because of our reliance on space-based technology like GPS. So if those satellites fall out of orbit because of these storms or they are irreparably damaged, this can affect banking, location services, transport. Think of everything that relies on those satellites that are flying around in space at the moment. And look, there have been other examples of what we've seen happen in peak solar output in history. In 1972, 25 sea mines off the coast of Vietnam blew up. It baffled the US military, and an inquiry later suggested the magnetically triggered mines had been detonated by a lash of solar energy. In 2003, there were so-called Halloween solar storms, and these disrupted half of Earth's satellites and destroyed one US satellite worth $640 million. Also, during that storm, crew on the ISS, the space station, had to take cover from increased radiation, and airlines spent up to $100,000 a flight rerouting commercial planes because they were trying to avoid spikes of radiation at Earth's poles. So everything's going to be okay, guys. I'm not trying to fearmonger here. All I'm trying to say is this is a legitimate thing that happens during the sun cycle, and so we're just at that point where it's putting out a lot of energy at the moment, and that can disrupt our modern technology. So it also gives us beautiful aurora australis, and as you said, we've been treated to a few this year, so hopefully more on the way. Chris, thank you so much for being here for the headlines. Next up, we are deep diving into why North Korea is sending its troops to Russia to fight in Ukraine and what that means for the globe. As we approach the third anniversary of the war in Ukraine, a new grim milestone has been reached. North Korea is formally dipping its toe into the conflict, with international intelligence suggesting anywhere from 10 to 30,000 of its troops are headed to join Russian forces fighting on the ground. It is a significant development and would mark the first time Pyongyang has intervened in an international conflict. So, does this spell the first step towards a world war? And what will the real impacts be of fresh feet on the ground in Ukraine? Joining me now to break it all down for us is Dr Keith Suter, global futurist and expert in geopolitics. Thanks so much for joining us on the briefing today.
Thank you.
Why is North Korea sending troops to Russia?
Russia is having difficulty winning in the war in Ukraine. So Russia invaded 2.5 years ago, expecting to have a victory within 10 days. It wasn't even called a war, it was called a special military operation. And that is still the fiction that the Russians are running with, as a special military operation. But they found the Ukrainians putting up much more of a fight than they'd expected. I think that the Russians anticipated that by invading the eastern side of Ukraine, which has got quite a few Russians still living there, that suddenly the country would fall apart and the Russians would be welcomed as liberators. That has not happened. So Russia is becoming more and more desperate. It's losing a lot of its own soldiers. The Russian style of fighting for centuries, nothing new with Putin, for centuries, they have used what's called a meat grinder approach. They will just flood the battlefield with more and more of their own personnel and just try to overwhelm the other side. And the Ukrainians have put up a very good fight, bearing in mind you've got 140 million Russians versus 40 million Ukrainians. And so the Ukrainians, armed by Western countries, have actually fought back and done quite well. They've made it more of a stalemate. About 18% of Ukraine, mainly in the east, is now under Russian control at the moment. The Ukrainians have also gone into Russia around the place called Kursk, which is, in military terms, a sacred territory. It was the largest tank battle ever fought in world history. It was fought there during World War II between the Russians and the Germans. So the Ukrainians have counterattacked, but it's basically a stalemate, just like World War I, with the Russians very slowly gaining more and more villages on the eastern side, but certainly not a major operation. So Russia is looking for ways to try to break that stalemate. One of the ways they've done it is to accept aid from North Korea. So North Korea is supplying, we think, somewhere perhaps of the order of 10,000, perhaps 30,000 troops. The intelligence reports are still very unclear. South Korea and Ukraine are both reporting that the North Koreans are now in Russia, getting ready to be mobilized to the eastern end of Ukraine for the Russian offensive. You've always got to be thinking about the weather when you think about Ukraine, because the winter will be setting in. Before the winter, you get lots of rain, and that wonderful Ukrainian soil turns to mud. So you can't use tanks in all that mud. So you've got to wait. You've got a window of opportunity when you can attack during the summer. Then you've got to wait for the land to absorb all the rain, and then it freezes during the winter. So you can go back to fighting for a short time. Then the spring will arrive. The frost melts, and so it becomes mud again, so you can't fight then, and then you wait for the summer. So it's a very seasonal conflict. And at the moment, obviously, the Russians are hoping to be able to make progress before the rains arrive for the winter. And so the North Koreans will be fed into that meat grinder. From the Ukrainian point of view, can't imagine they'd be too worried about the North Koreans because they've had no battle experience. Their experience in North Korea has been basically patrolling the border between North and South Korea. They haven't actually fought a war since 1953, the Korean armistice. So the troops are not well trained, they're not well experienced, and I can tell you from experience, as soon as you start going under fire, your whole view of the world changes.
Yep.
And the risk that the Russians run is that the North Koreans may well, in fact, decide to desert when they're being fired upon by the Ukrainians. So that's the current state of play. The North Koreans are also returning back to the Russians some of the equipment that they've given over the years to the North Koreans. So that's been an advantage for the Russians because the North Koreans will be arriving with their own Russian-supplied equipment. So at least the troops know what equipment to use. And so they may provide some of a boost. I think it's, instead of looking at it from the military point of view, it's probably better to look at it from the political point of view. So with the political point of view, you've got North Korea showing solidarity with the Russians. And so Russia can say, we're not alone in this struggle. And we can try to internationalise it, which is what you always want to do in a conflict. And, of course, that also then worries NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, which does not have at the moment Ukraine as a member, but some of the NATO members are supplying equipment to Ukraine. So it's becoming more and more of an internationalized conflict.
Yeah, well, Volodymyr Zelensky said over the weekend that this marks the first step towards world war. Do you agree with that?
It could easily spin out of control. That's the worry. The Americans and British, but particularly the Americans, have put limitations on the use to which Ukraine can use the equipment being supplied by the United States. They say to Ukraine, you can only use our equipment to kill Russians at the eastern end of Ukraine or the southern side, which would be around the Crimea. You can't fire them into Russia itself. Now, what the Ukrainians want to be able to do is to fire some of those missiles right into Russia, where the Russians are assembling the troops ready to go back into eastern Ukraine. But the Americans are very worried because that would be a head-on collision with Russia. And Putin, over the last 2.5 years, has made all sorts of threats about using limited nuclear weapons. He's not yet done so, but there's always the risk that at some point his patience will snap and he will then fire a warning shot with nuclear missiles into some part of Western Europe.
Well, I wanted to bring up nuclear as well. This, if it's, and the intelligence seems to suggest that it is true, but this would mark North Korea's first kind of significant intervention in an international conflict. How concerning is that? Because my thought goes to their nuclear capabilities, which we obviously know very little about, but we know that they have nuclear capabilities. So is this adding another facet to an already extremely precarious situation?
Well, at the moment, I'm not worried about nuclear weapons from North Korea. I'm more worried about Russian nuclear weapons. The thing to note about North Korea is that they are now a nuclear power and therefore untouchable. So if the Americans were going to stop the North Korean regime, it should have been done years ago. It's now too late. North Korea now has its own nuclear weapons and so can't be intimidated by the Americans, but they will now, North Korea, be able to intimidate its neighbours, like South Korea or Japan. And that's the risk that we now run, because now North Korea has acquired nuclear weapons, is officially a nuclear weapon state, although not actually given that status yet, I don't think, by the United Nations. But it means that there'll be pressures on Japan and South Korea, and I think ultimately Australia, to go down the path of acquiring nuclear weapons to reply to North Korea.
What about the international community's response, I suppose, to these intelligence reports? We've heard South Korea summoning and speaking to its Russian ambassador, NATO Secretary General, Britain's foreign minister are among those who have come out to publicly denounce it. I mean, we know that North Korea kind of runs its own race in global politics, but are we doing enough internationally to condemn this move?
Well, North Korea ignores the international community. And by doing so, it has been able to buy time to build up its nuclear weapons, including probably assistance from Russia. Probably not China. China is more concerned about trade than war. But certainly North Korea may have acquired assistance from the Russians. But basically, the North Koreans are their own country, and they ignore what the rest of the world has to do. They've been under international sanctions for many years, but they've still managed to carry on. And there are still people who are willing to trade with North Korea. Yeah,
well, let's talk about India's role in all of this, because North Korea isn't the only one that's kind of been speaking with Russia and having diplomatic relations. India has been as well. What's their role in all of this?
India plays on both sides of the street. So during the old Cold War, the previous Cold War between the United States and the then Soviet Union, India saw itself as a leader of what they called the non-aligned world. In other words, the third world, the world that didn't want to get linked with the first world United States or second world Soviet Union. But it tilted towards the Soviet Union because the United States tilted towards Pakistan. And they were the two great enemies, India and Pakistan. There's a lot of weaponry that India uses that came out of the old Soviet Union. It has good links still with Russia. And so the problem for India is to work out what side of the street is it going to be on, because it's now got a new problem, which is called China. I noticed that they are trying to reduce the tensions on the border between India and China. For example, their soldiers are not allowed to shoot each other, but they fight on glaciers and try to push one another over the ice and let them fall into the glacier below or whatever. But they don't use weapons. So the borders are very unclear. And of course, with climate change, the borders will start to move again as the ice melts. So India now has a new problem, which is China. And so when it's looking into the future, it looks at the 21st century as a century between competition of China and India, right? There are now already more Indians on the planet than there are Chinese. So China is in a population decline era. The Indians are still increasing their population. And so their current issue is, how do we respond with Ukraine? Do we follow our American allies or do we follow our Russian allies? In the meantime, they are breaching international sanctions by buying Russian oil, which is at bargain basement prices because the Russians are desperate to sell the oil, which they can't sell to Western Europe. But looking to the long term, India is also worried about China. And so India is working with the United States, Australia, Japan in what's called the Quad, which is not a new NATO arrangement, but it's just simply some sort of a gathering of those four countries. And those four countries, including India, are getting ready for the conflict with China. So India wants to remain on good terms with Western countries because it fears China. But in the meantime, it also wants to remain on good terms with the Russians. So they're slightly schizophrenic, playing both sides of the street.
Well, as always, it's kind of one of those conflicts that kind of keeps giving, and we're learning more and more about international relations as it goes. Dr. Keith Suter, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Keith Suter, one of Australia's leading commentators on global affairs and geopolitics. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. Thanks so much for listening. Before you go, we would love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might like to hear it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, we are on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.